Hello, everyone, and welcome to Storytime with Dr. Katie. I'm so happy you decided to join me today. We are going to practice answering WH questions today. WH questions start with the words who, what, where, when, and why. Who questions are answered with a person. What questions are answered with a thing. Where questions are answered with a location. When questions are answered with time, and why questions are answered with because. So put on your good listening ears and try to answer the questions today. Our book today is Curious George, written and illustrated by H.A. Ray and published by the Houghton Mifflin Company of Boston, Massachusetts. Curious George was first copywritten in 1941. This is George. He lived in Africa. He was a good little monkey and always very curious. Where did George live? George lived in Africa. One day, George saw a man. He had on a large yellow straw hat. The man saw George, too. What a nice little monkey, he thought. I would like to take him home with me. He put his hat on the ground, and of course George was curious. He came down from the tree to look at the large yellow hat. What did the man put on the ground? The man put his hat on the ground. The hat had been on the man's head. George thought it would be nice to have it on his own head. He picked it up and put it on. What did George do with the hat? George put the hat on his head. The hat covered George's head. He couldn't see. The man picked him up quickly and popped him into a bag. George was caught. Why couldn't George see? Because the hat covered George's head. The man with the big yellow hat put George into a little boat, and a sailor rowed them both across the water to a big ship. George was sad, but he was still a little curious. Who put George into a little boat? The man with the big yellow hat put George into the boat. On the big ship, things began to happen. The man took off the bag. George sat on a little stool, and the man said, "George, I am going to take you to a big zoo in a big city. You will like it there. Now run along and play, but don't get into trouble." George promised to be good, but it is easy for little monkeys to forget. Where was the man taking George? The man was taking George to a big zoo in a big city. On the deck, he found some seagulls. He wondered how they could fly. He was very curious. Finally, he had to try. It looked easy, but what did George find on the deck? George found some seagulls. Oh, what happened? First this, then this. What happened to George? George fell into the water. Oh no! Where is George? The sailors looked and looked. At last they saw him struggling in the water and almost all tired out. Who was looking for George? The sailors were looking for George. "Man overboard!" the sailors cried as they threw him a lifebelt. George caught it and held on. At last he was safe on board. What did the sailors throw to George? The sailors threw George a life belt. After that, George was more careful to be a good monkey until at last the long trip was over. George said goodbye to the kind sailors, and he and the man with the yellow hat walked off the ship onto the shore and on into the city to the man's house. Where did George and the man with the yellow hat go? They went into the city to the man's house. After a good meal and a good pipe, George felt very tired. Why did George feel so very tired? Because he had a long journey. He crawled into bed and fell asleep at once. When did George fall asleep? As soon as he crawled into bed. The next morning, the man telephoned the zoo. George watched him. He was fascinated. Then the man went away. George was curious. He wanted to telephone too. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. What fun! What did George watch the man do? George watched the man telephone the zoo. Ding-a-ling-a-ling! George had telephoned the fire station. The firemen rushed to the telephone. "Hello, hello," they said, but there was no answer. Then they looked for the signal on the big map that showed where the telephone call had come from. They didn't know it was George. They thought it was a real fire. Who answered the telephone? The firemen at the fire station answered the telephone. Hurry, hurry, hurry! The firemen jumped onto the fire engines and onto the hook and ladders. Ding dong, ding dong! Everyone out of the way! Hurry, hurry, hurry! What did the firemen jump on? They jumped on the fire engines and hook and ladders. The firemen rushed into the house. They opened the door. No fire, only a naughty little monkey. "Oh, catch him," they cried. George tried to run away. He almost did, but he got caught in the telephone wire. What did George get caught in? George got caught in the telephone wire. A thin fireman caught one arm, and a fat fireman caught the other. "You fooled the fire department," they said. "We will have to shut you up where you can't do any more harm." They took him away and shut him in a prison. Where did the firemen shut George? They shut him in a prison. George wanted to get out. He climbed up to the window to try the bars. Just then, the watchman came in. He got on the wooden bed to catch George, but he was too big and too heavy. The bed tipped up, the watchman fell over, and quick as lightning, George ran out through the open door. Why did the watchman fall over? Because the bed tipped when the watchman got onto it. He hurried through the building and out onto the roof. And then he was lucky to be a monkey. Out he walked onto the telephone wires. Quickly and quietly over the guard's head, George walked away. He was free. What did George walk on to escape prison? George walked on the telephone wires. Down in the street outside the prison wall stood a balloon man. A little girl bought a balloon for her brother. George watched. He was curious again. He felt he must have a bright red balloon. He reached over and tried to help himself. What color balloon did George want? George wanted a red balloon. But instead of one balloon, the whole bunch broke loose. In an instant, the wind whisked them all away, and with them went George, holding tight with both hands. What whisked George and the balloons away? The wind whisked George and the balloons away. Up, up he sailed, higher and higher. The houses looked like toy houses, and the people like dolls. George was frightened. He held on very tight. Why was George frightened? George was frightened because he was up so high in the sky. At first, the wind blew in great gusts. Then it quieted. Finally, it stopped blowing altogether. George was very tired. Down, down he went, bump, onto the top of a traffic light. Everyone was surprised. The traffic got all mixed up. George didn't know what to do. And then he heard someone call, "George!" He looked down and saw his friend, the man with the big yellow hat. Who called George's name? The man with the big yellow hat did. George was very happy. The man was happy too. George slid down the post, and the man with the big yellow hat put him under his arm. Then he paid the balloon man for all the balloons. And then George and the man climbed into the car, and at last away they went. Who paid the balloon man for the balloons? The man with the yellow hat paid the balloon man. They went to the zoo. What a nice place for George to live. Where did the man take George? The man took George to the zoo. I hope you enjoyed that story and you were able to answer some of those questions. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye.